And we are live. I am joined by another wonderful German from Westphalia, Mr. Mono. How are you doing today, sir?
Hi. Well, I'm doing great. Looking forward to starting another wonderful week in this splendid year 2023.
Yes, the year should be full of surprises as last year was.
Already going
Seems
off to a great start.
yes, we almost had like a World War III scare with Poland. We've had this war continue on. Crises, although some positive things are predictions about the extremely harsh winter were wrong, as you were kind of telling me about earlier,
Hmm.
being much more mild than you thought. But I think the main reason we're here is a couple weeks ago there was quite an uproar in the media about this. Some of these some based boomers, even a member of a royal family in Germany, trying to start a monarchist uprising in Germany. They made this like this Hitler reincarnated. The Fourth Reich is just around the corner if we don't constantly suppress dissident opinions. But was this actually a monarchist restoration? What do you think? Can you kind of explain what actually happened?
Well, at the end of the day, it was about 50 people, most of them retirees, boomers generally, that had started to prepare for something like a coup, but were swiftly detected by the security apparatus, and then, with a lot of media buzz, were arrested. Um, the journalists who covered the story knew about 2 weeks in advance that the arrests were going to happen, and the whole thing is uh, about as much of a charade as the whole Gretchen Whitmer abduction disaster. So it wouldn't surprise me if hardly anyone ever goes to jail about this, because it was just such a ridiculous case.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I would make the comparison to a Jan 6 event. But I think I wouldn't even call it that because it really isn't, I guess, as interesting as you were telling me. We didn't have a QAnon shaman president, storming the, we didn't have a group of German patriots storming the Reichstag with a Q shaman,
Hmm.
with German Empire flags. But I think another group also that's been kind of stirring around the fringes is the Reichsbürgers group. I'm not exactly sure much. I don't know much about this group, although it sounds like a federal group just by its name.
Well, this is a truly weird and very German phenomenon. Now, just from the get go, we need to make a difference between two different layers. On the most obvious layer, this is a slur used against anyone who is uh, a bit off the deep end, or who exudes too much dissident energy, because the Reichsbürger, as a German would pronounce it, have become the most acceptable of the acceptable targets. In this way, it's basically the German version of Q. Now, in the strictly literal sense, it's a loose conglomeration of various groups who, for one reason or another, do not consider the German government structure to be legitimate. Um, I would probably have to go a little bit into history, if that's okay.
No, go ahead.
Now, when World War II ended, it ended with a capitulation of the German army. There was no peace treaty signed until 1990, and nobody actually ever bothered to write on an official document that the German Reich had. Um, and this was very handy for the old Federal Republic that we had all the decades after the war, because they could always claim that A, it technically, as a legal technicality, still existed, so there was still a theoretical legal claim to certain territories. And on the other hand, since it technically still existed as they claimed, they were not a successor state, and as such, not liable. So you couldn't sue the German government for actions during World War II. So a couple of times a year, some token German politician would go on about how the German Reich was never officially abolished. But I think by now we know that all these legal technicalities are completely irrelevant. There's a de facto government. and it governs. And any theoretical claims of constitutions that more or less could be still in existence is basically pointless. And from there on, you have dozens of different strands. For example, you have people who still wave around the Weimar Constitution because this was, funnily enough, never officially abolished by the Nazis. And there's people who, well, want to return to Imperial Germany. Others claim there's a German government in exile, and the one we have is just a corporation set up by the Western Allies. Basically, all kinds of variations you could think of.
Wow, it really does sound like a collection of just quite a lot of different groups there, but all kind of united under this banner of opposing the U.S. Led regime in Germany, which we systematically imposed through our denazification program.
Yes, that's what it usually revolves around. But the weird thing is that, of course, the trope that the German government has been propped up by the US was a staple of the propaganda by the communist half of Germany during the Cold War. So I don't even think that that many of the people from the Reichsbürger movement could be, in their origins, be described as right wing. A lot of them have a weird kind of boomer cope that, a proper government should represent the people and respect our human rights, and they still cling to this idea that somewhere out there's a government who has the true interests of the people at heart, and they will bring back real democracy. It's pretty depressing.
Yeah, yeah, I would say so. I mean, considering all the elections in modern Germany, I mean, it's kind of pointless with a socially imposed regime and history that goes out of its way to demonize any form of nationalism whatsoever because of this one group of people and their actions in the past, kind of influencing the minds of many Germans. That such behavior isn't acceptable at all, and that's why we must make up for our sin of that era by being the most tolerant, progressive, and accepting migrants as much as possible. Is that kind of the mindset, you think?
Well, I think that's the practical consequence that a lot of different approaches on how to deal with the past lead to. I mean, one popular strand, for example, it's rarely stated in the terms that I'm going to use, but that's what it boils to, is that there's essentially a nice Germany and a naughty Germany. And throughout history, we have seen a fight between the nice Germany and the naughty Germany. And now nowadays, modern-day Germans, as representatives of the nice Germany, need to look to the past and condemn the naughty Germany. And basically all historical figures that we have decided today are off-colored, distasteful, what have you, are to be, removed from street names and charged of whatever crime in history books, and so on and so on. It's basically a kind of exorcism performed against ourselves, with a clear consciousness of being part of the nice Germany. This is a large part of it. Then there's just the complete the faction that is completely hostile to the very notion of Germany itself, and but the usual uniting factors are all there. Your anti-national / post-national and all that kind of good stuff.
So we have a typical cadre of people who run the West, is what you're trying to say.
Yes, basically. Now, one additional problem that Germany has had historically is the divide between Catholics and Protestants. And when Germany was reunified in the 19th century, under Imperial Germany, under Bismarck, the Catholics became a clear-cut minority in Germany and were to some degree alienated as a minority. Now, the problem is that the standard center-right party that we had, the CDU, in the post-World War II era, was largely dominated by Catholics. So they already had a not very nationalist outlook, even back in the 19th century, and had a more universalist outlook that wasn't overly concerned about overly focused on Germany as a nation state.
Well, that's interesting, actually. That is a good point because a lot of these states, I mean, let's not forget Germany was only unified in the 18th century, which isn't long in terms of historical terms at all. It's quite very recent. And a lot of these southern German states were independent for hundreds of years. Their own kingdoms, in fact, Bavaria and Swabia
Well, I
being
mean,
the most prominent, probably, of those.
in theory, Germany was a unified empire until 1805, when Napoleon dissolved the First German Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. But that was essentially a loose confederation, and the states were independent for all intents and purposes hundreds of years before that.
Yeah, for a large descent. They all had their regional identities, but they all spoke the common language of German for the most part.
Yeah, which of course is gladly taken by a lot of the more liberal types in Germany these days. Like the Germanic tribes, they were just made up by Caesar, and Germany doesn't even really exist. It's just a couple of regions with their dialects. There's nothing really that unites Germany. No such thing as German culture besides language. Everything you can imagine in a modern day European country.
Oh yes, the idea we're a nation state that it's just an idea. Anyone could be a German as long as they speak the language and adopt liberal capitalism. Basically.
Absolutely. Although there are, of course, a couple of crazies, and have existed since the 90s, which essentially claimed that demanding integration is already too much. That's a bit too chauvinistic to demand that people learn the language. But these have died down, gladly. So we're making huge progress here.
Oh, that sounds like something Angela Merkel would say, or one of her cadre. Many interesting theories about her and where she came from. But
the weird thing about Angela Merkel is that she was born in West Germany, but her father defected to East Germany. So he willingly went over to the communist side in the 50s, I think. And her grandfather was a German soldier in World War I, who then became a POW in France and decided to join a Polish legion that fought on the side of the Entente. So you have more or less 3 consecutive generations of turning your back on Germany.
Well, no wonder where all those problems came from. That makes sense, and the fact that she's part of the Liberal Party now, what formerly used to be the center right. I mean, all parties in Germany except for AfD, as far as I understand, are pretty much far left in terms of social policies. The AfD being the only one who's not.
One of the idiosyncrasies of Germany is that the term right is strictly reserved for extremists. So the CDU would never claim to be a right-wing party. There's not this idea that there's a left and a right, like Tories and Labour, Republicans and Democrats. So none of them would call themselves right-wing. There's lefties, socialists, liberals, conservatives, and then far to the side there are right-wingers, and this is basically equated to Nazis. So the idea of a political right as an abstract is already beyond the pale in Germany.
Yeah, I know they constantly bring up examples of these crazies, regardless of who where they came from, if they're mentally ill, if they like to claim, oh, if you allow these types of people and open to dialogue, they're going to become mass shooters. You know what I mean? Example, synagogue shooting 500 something, or whatever.
Yeah. And I mean, naturally, those who are truly off the deep end are completely saturated with glowies. There's a party in Germany called the NPD, who was actually founded by literal ex-Nazis in the 1960s. They still exist, the party, and they've tried to ban it twice in the last 20 years. And the first time around they tried to ban it, the Supreme Court of Germany ruled that they couldn't do it because there were so many glowies in the party that would get exposed if the party was banned. They would put their lives at risk. So this is the state of the German fringe. Can't even get banned because there's too many glowies. They're basically government employees.
90% glowies, 10% super autistic boomers who read too much of a certain Austrian painter from the 19th century.
Yeah, sounds about right.
That's quite a hard state, but it could always be worse. You could always be Sweden, which is just another level of off the deep end.
Yeah, it's pretty weird how some countries like Sweden and Ireland just try to speed run everything. Well, other countries like I think Germany and Austria are super buck broken on stuff like national identity. But if you portray yourself as a proper regionalist and anti-national and everything, you could get away with quite a bit of social conservatism in Germany for a pretty long time. For example, technically in Germany, abortion is still banned. Now, in a typical way of loose compromise, you won't get punished if you do it, but it's technically still banned.
Oh, that's quite impressive, actually. I didn't know that even existed still in the books. But as we all know, it's who's in power actually enforces the laws.
Mhm.
You know.
Yes. Same thing, by the way, with homosexuality, which technically was banned in Germany until the 1990s. But again, you couldn't get punished for it since I think already the 60s or so.
Yeah, I think Germany is one of those countries where what we did after World War II was, insanely brutal, even worse than what the Soviets did to their Eastern European empire. They didn't fundamentally change the society in the way we did, which was way too far, and essentially told them they have to be American-like in every single way, and that previous self-identity and expression was explicitly forbidden because of Mustache Man. And if we even allow if we even allow those ideas, Mustache Man will come back inevitably.
Yes. And I mean, our constitution was pretty much drafted, inspired by the American Constitution. For example, we have two chambers, and one of which has usually is just commonly elected members of parliament, and the other one has delegations from the member states, which are not proportionate to the population, but scaled a bit. And some politicians of the olden days quite openly stated that this constitution took quite a bit of inspiration from the US. And basically the main opposition party in the 50s and 60s, the Social Democrats, were run by a generation of politicians that had been hand-selected by the Americans.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And we still occupy Germany. We haven't left. I believe we still have 10,000 troops in Germany to this day or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact number, but we still occupy the country. It hasn't ended.
And
which I know is kind of a mute point. But
the funny thing is that a lot of people in Germany would be greatly upset if the Americans left. Now, I mean, of course, a lot of people would be happy and have the usual left-wing anti-Americanism. But if the Americans ever tried out, you would hear outcries about, oh no, we have these small towns with military bases, and all the business in the city would die down if the soldiers were gone. The American soldiers need to stay there to keep supermarkets in small towns afloat.
Would you think about the small businesses that must keep going? It's quite funny because Germany, after we destroyed the country in World War II, we needed an ally to prop up against the Eastern Bloc, and so it was decided that Germany would be America's main ally in Europe. So they would be rebuilt up to be the best symbol of what liberal capitalism could be. That's why they were given the most attention by the U.S. for the longest time. West Germany was, and still is, to a large extent. Poland is now taking above them in terms of U.S. military preference and priorities.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Polish political establishment is much more solidly pro-NATO than the Germans ever were. I mean, diplomatically, everyone was firmly committed to NATO and everything, but at least since 1990, like significant parts of the German political establishment and ever-growing parts have been not openly hostile to NATO, but they didn't really see the point of even keeping the Bundeswehr in fighting shape and keeping the the concessions made to NATO, like investing a certain amount of GDP into the military. So in practical terms, NATO and the Western alliance is growing less and less popular. But of course, once a conflict like Ukraine rolls around, everyone is solidly pro-Ukraine. That goes without saying.
Yes, indeed. Once the global American military-industrial complex is fixated on the war, usually all of our colonies fall into lockstep.
It's that weird dynamic. I think Curtis Yarvin even wrote about it, that the most anti-American people are in a way hyper-Americanized as well. So there's, apart from a few true reactionaries, almost no actual anti-Americanism. It's just that the hyper-Americanized youth needs to LARP as anti-Americans, while in actuality being the most Americanized generation in German history, with more and more English words creeping into everyday parlance, and everything, cultural trends being emulated, and so on and so on.
Yeah, I think we kind of saw this with the BLM riots being exported, cultural Marxism, critical race theory, all these things that are created in American institutions,
Oh,
coming
yes.
about to Germany, which doesn't make any logical sense. Being part of the American network means that they come as part of the deal, essentially, one way or another. They will be forced upon you.
And the weird thing is that Germany had almost no normal immigration into Germany until the 1990s. I mean, we had guest workers in the 60s and 70s, but this was a pretty static minority once they stopped coming in the 70s, or we made them stop coming in the 70s. The Helmut Kohl, chancellor from 82 to 98, actually tried to force some of them back, but that didn't work. But then in the 90s, the gates opened, first slowly and in several waves. But these last couple of years, like since 2015 or so, it's just beyond measure.
Yes, they went from a trickle to a giant flood. And of course, our leaders, the ones they're supposed to protect our national interests, are holding up open the gates to allow the water in. Screaming at you if you try to tell them they should stop.
Yes, and I mean, it's the difference is obvious. It's one of those things where even a lot of the people who'd never think about speaking out against immigration or who support immigration, I think most of them sense that the country has changed, that it's more dangerous. I mean, there's always a group of people who are so ardently in denial that you could never change their mind. But I think in general, people do realize. They do realize that that you can't sit in a public park on a meadow without being approached by a sub-Saharan guy trying to sell you something. That was not the case 10 years ago. It didn't exist.
Or quite famously, this was quite famous a couple of years ago with that they had to build walls in Christmas markets in Germany because of all the new immigrants didn't like that. Christmas bombings. Who was shot? Cars suddenly became a thing which didn't exist before.
Yes, absolutely. In my hometown, for example, they have surrounded the main marketplace with mobile barriers that can be raised from the ground in case any big event is held there.
Which is something that happens in Iraq or something.
Yes, first time I saw that was in front of the U.S. embassy in Berlin, and I guess plenty of U.S. embassies have that around the world.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I just heard about it at the Christmas markets because famously there was that truck who ran through people in 2015. I forgot what year it happened. But.
Yeah, and And I mean, this was of course once again a cautionary tale. I mean, it was a guy who had come in with that first large refugee trail in the autumn of 2015. It was a complete failure of the security apparatus, who could not track this guy due to the dispersed nature of the federalized German system. Um, and after the thing had happened, the German government did fuck all to talk to some of the families of the deceased people. They just tried to memory hole it, never spoke about it, and yeah, not not very statesmanlike, as Merkel had.
No, we're quite famous the Cologne New Year's, where a bunch of German women were raped by all these new immigrants who were welcomed in uh, on New Year's
Yes,
Eve.
and what was the response? What was the response? I went to college, like not too far away from Cologne, and what did people on campus do? They drove to Cologne the next week, handing out roses to immigrants and telling them, "We know you're not all like this, and the most important thing right now is that we oppose racism."
No, it's quite insane that this religion has occupied the West, that these people in the the government positions constantly propagate. Is absolutely insane. The sin of racism is the greatest thing.
Hmm.
Your
And I mean,
people's health or history be damned. You know.
and I completely get why groups like the Reichsbürger get some kind of like increasing support or increasing credibility, because the notion that the government is not acting on behalf of the people and for the best interests of the country is glaringly obvious. Um, the problem, though, of course, is that they have the assumption that somewhere out there a reasonable government may exist that will properly secure the rights of the German people. With some of them being sympathetic to Russia, others not. It's hard to tell to which degree this is an organic phenomenon and to which degree this is actually willingly accepted by the security apparatus, because they're just such a convenient target for being nut jobs.
Yes, whenever we need a story to propagate, or we want to crack down on more speech. Oh, another a plot was just uncovered. Oh, that's convenient. We need to crack down more because clearly sorry, the German painter is just around the corner if we don't constantly do something.
Yes, as a friend of mine once put it, in Germany, the demand for Nazis greatly outpaces the supply.
Which is just absolutely insane. This is what governments are reduced to the year 2023. But that's what the global liberal capitalism needs to sustain itself. The narrative, because people are starting to lose faith in the narrative.
I think so too, because it becomes harder and harder. I mean, 20 years ago, it was a meme on German television, more or less. That Nazi grandpa, who would say some off-colored stuff that would relate to his experiences in the war or the Hitler Youth or whatever. But naturally, these people have died out. There are no more Nazi grandpas out there, so we need to supplement it. But it doesn't match the reality that people see in the streets. I personally don't know any Nazis, gotta be honest, and I don't know anyone who knows Nazis. And they probably exist out there, LARPing. That's, for the most part, it's just not credible. And as much as the government likes to prop up these things, and the usual liberal cadres are enthusiastic about the thrill of fighting Nazis, it just doesn't square with the reality on the ground.
No, it really doesn't. Because they so successfully occupied the mind space and cultural narrative of most Germans that would be a no go at all to even think about. Even to be a nationalist is too far. It's too close to the Austrian pattern.
Yes, and I sincerely believe that if ever someone in Germany had a true will to power to pull off a move to actually rule the country, he would never burden himself with certain imaginary or allusions to, or alluding to the Nazis or anything like that, because it would just be impractical. Like Pavlov's dogs, the people here have been conditioned to look out for that kind of stuff. So it's there's not even a tactical use to playing to that.
No, it's to our enemy's advantage. That any group does that. That's why I believe now that any group which openly does that is federally involved in some way or another,
Yes,
or they're
yes,
being
absolutely.
used for that purpose.
Mm.
Because all it does is trigger the narrative in minds of people. So even if you try to talk to people, if you're going to be on that side of things, that oh, it's base, so we have to do it. Oh, well, okay, well, try to talk to a normal person like that. They're immediately going to dismiss you as insane and crazy, and that you want to kill people, and you don't get anywhere. So it's very pointless in my mind to try to resurrect these symbols, try to convince people with them. Despite the narratives that surround them, whether they may be true or not, it's not a great tactic, especially considering the situation in the West right now.
Absolutely, and if you want to take any lesson from how the Nazis rose to power, that's not what they did. They did not generally resurrect just stuff that worked a couple of decades ago. They were cutting edge in terms of propaganda techniques, campaigning, organizing, structuring the party, and they crafted something new, something entirely new, which Germany hadn't seen before. So if anyone wants to take a lesson from them, this should be it.
Yes, it's the right lesson and not the fad lesson, as we'll call it. They want you to learn about, because all these groups love that. They love it. They love Nazis, honestly, because they constantly fantasize about busting a group of them or something. Even though all like 90% of them are like federal agents.
Yes, and I mean, like every year or every other year, a story like that actually happens. Where in some hinterland small town, a couple of dudes get together and think, how do we change this country? Oh, I know. We should set up a militia group, right? And then we start ordering stuff on the internet, like body bags, cable binders. We try to steal ammunition. We produce lists of politicians. And then we get busted. Perfect dissident right playbook in Germany happens every year or so.
No, you would think people are starting to kind of learn from this lesson, this kind of mind game. Hopefully, I think maybe some are kind of trying to learn from this. Do you think some people are kind of learning from this, like constant like show, seeing the show over and over again?
Well, it's difficult because there is. I think there's probably two different kinds of approaches here, and I think both are not very promising. On one hand, you have the AFD and adjacent groups who pretty obviously copy stuff from the MAGA crowd, and it just doesn't translate to German. It all sounds and feels a bit. They're trying too hard. It doesn't feel natural. And on the other hand, you actually do have a bit of an underground movement in Germany, which is occasionally committing crimes. I don't know if you heard about this, but about I think 8 or 9 years ago, a group of 3 people calling themselves the National Socialist Underground were busted, and they had been driving around the country for a decade or so, murdering immigrants with small business owners and so on, with the idea that this would trigger some kind of tyrannical response that would then agitate the masses. And so this milieu actually does exist, of people who are willing to commit crimes. Yes. Problem is, of course, that these groups have a kind of symbiosis with the German Secret Service. So these groups are infiltrated by feds, but the problem is that the Secret Service can't properly control the feds. So these groups never go anywhere, but they never go away either. And they usually commit a bit more crime than the Secret Service would like them to. And it's becoming a bit too obvious, because the process against this NSU that was uncovered a couple of years ago, this was one of the largest political processes that we've seen, and this went to court and everything, and it was a really bad look for the German Secret Service. So this. It's a stagnant situation that doesn't really go anywhere, but on the other hand, it's getting less and less compelling by the year.
Narrative is losing its grasp.
Yes, exactly.
Ever so slightly.
Did you ever hear about? I mean, I don't want to get all kooky here, but did you ever hear about Gladio and Stay Behind operations in Europe by NATO?
I have not.
This is a bit of a Cold War deep lore. There was basically a plan by NATO to set up groups in various countries in Europe that, if Europe was overrun by the Soviets, would form cells and perform resistance against the Soviets. So they recruited the most anti-communist elements they could find, people that may or may not have had some prior training in the German or Italian or French army or so. And essentially, stay-behind networks were created and trained. And both in Italy and in Germany, from these networks, actual Nazi groups emerged after the Cold War. And you could never properly prosecute them, because it would, of course, be a bad look for NATO.
I didn't know that. That's quite interesting. We kind of see parallels now, actually, with the situation in the blue and yellow country.
Mm-hmm.
With us propping up these groups as our kind of meat shields who will go fight our proxy wars for us. Because whether they like it or not, these groups of people are going to be the most likely to, be strong and masculine and actually be good on the front lines of actual combat.
Yes, and I think we've seen the same thing with America right now. The army has a hard time to fill its ranks with recruits. They still need the boys from Appalachia to die abroad, and it's tough, because at the end of the day, what's worth dying for in the current political climate?
Nothing really. That's actually why recruitment is down, is because traditionally the South, which is the military heartland of the U.S., we're starting to kind of learn the lessons from the wars in the Middle East, all these wars that don't benefit us or our national interest, and are also led by the same people who constantly talk about critical race theory and how white people need to learn to be quiet and apologize for their racism. You know what I mean? These are what our top generals are saying. So it's like a lot of us are disaffected. That's why recruitment is actually down.
And recruitment is notoriously down in Germany too, since about a decade. I mean, we did have the draft, of course, during the Cold War, and after we absorbed East Germany after 1990, the German army had almost 600,000 soldiers, and since then we've pretty much constantly been cutting on personnel. And right now, I think on paper, the German army has probably about 180,000 soldiers or so. And about 10 years ago, in 2011, I think, the draft was abolished. So me being in my late 20s, I was one of the first cohorts that didn't have to go through the draft. The problem with this, of course, is that while during the draft, the army was very heterogeneous, you had left-wing people, right-wing people, a cross-section of society would join the army for a year. This no longer is the case. So for a couple of years, basically only right-wingers joined the army. Until the German government noticed this and started to weed them out, or did their best to do that. The problem, of course, is that this was one of the few groups left willing to join the German army. So they are starving for manpower, and think the same is probably true in the US. Standards are falling more and more in terms of weight, height, performance, and so on.
Yeah, they have to recruit constantly from the lowest common denominator of fat, trans, poor people, people who still like unquestionably buy the narrative. Some of these newer groups are being brought in by them,
Mm-hmm.
but
I have
as they bring those people in, the quality of their army, just goes down and down and down. So like this is a major problem for them.
Yes, yes. In Germany, you pretty much draw a straight line from GDR propaganda and their usual talking points about the German army, like, oh, it's useless. They not fight. They wouldn't even be willing to fight. So the demoralization tactics of the Cold War have more or less carried over into the mainstream. In German civil society, no one is taking the army serious. Like the usual stereotype is they do nothing but drink all day, and they're generally like incapable idiots. So there is no such thing as respect the troops in Germany. Quite the contrary.
Well, not really, because they haven't really fought in a recent war that would be like even worth having that cultural narrative surrounding that.
Exactly. For example, in Germany, we did not call the war in Afghanistan a war. It was just an operation to secure the country. A special militarized operation, if you will. But for years and years, it was completely taboo to call it a war in Germany. So, wouldn't even admit that the soldiers were actually involved in a war. And I mean, basically, we still have the military, for tradition's sake and because we're kind of used to it. But on the other hand, we kind of don't want to have it anymore, talking about the political establishment, of course. So we more or less starve them of resources to have them die slowly, if you will.
Yes, but you actually was mentioning the bifurcation of the military because of their own narratives. I think they actually had to disband the special unit of the German army because it was too based for them. There was just too many patriots in it, so they had to just disband the unit. I believe was the story around that, which I just found hilarious.
That could be the case. Yes, I mean it's absolutely crazy. For example, a buddy of mine volunteered to become an officer a couple of years ago, and he had to fill out a sheet of paper, and they asked for his religion, and it had like dozens of options, including a couple of neo-pagan stuff. And he asked the recruiter if this was actually a thing, if a lot of neo-pagan Jews actually joined the military. And the recruiter basically told him, well, every now and then someone checks that box, but we never take them. They are immediately isolated as Nazi extremists. We don't take them at all. So they're absolutely panicking about the German army being subverted in some way by right-wingers. A few years ago, they throughout Germany went through military installations and basically confiscated everything that was related to the past. Books that were too based. I think in one case they even took a cavalry saber from the Napoleonic Wars because it was too militaristic.
Wow, that's pretty extreme, even for the West standards. But denazification and its consequences have been a disaster for Germany. But going into more recent topics, according to recent studies, like I believe the number is like 43% of German youth are actually nostalgic for the monarchy.
Well, there is a saying that you hear a couple of times if you talk to the more based portion of the German youth online, and that is in the past not everything was better. They would say everything was more German in the past. I think if we look at those images from back in the day, people just instinctively realize that this is something that we have deep connections to. This is us. This is what we are. This is what we were. And this was a true expression of our people and of our nation's history. And I mean, the optics are of course amazing, um, and then there's just video games. I mean, let's be honest about it. I think games like Hearts of Iron, for example, they don't generally like radicalize people in any kind of political sense, but I think people do come in contact with stuff from the past, and they can't shake the aesthetics of it.
Yeah, especially compared to everything they see now, which is gay, ugly, boring, and hates you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in America, at least, if you try to make it in politics, you get your teeth fixed and bleached, and you get a hair transplant, and you will have some advisor telling you to lose weight. That doesn't exist in Germany. You will just have fat slobs, basket cases on the physiognomic level, Norwooding all over the place. So German politics isn't really filled to the brim with people you would respect on a very basic personal level.
Do you think that's just because of the different culture, or what do you think's behind that? Is it just like apathy from the malaise of how things are?
Well, I think apathy plays a part in that. The other part is just you don't really have to do this stuff in Germany. Politics in Germany is incredible, provincial in its nature, if you will. The weird thing is, in Germany, you more or less have a system that governs itself. For example, how are the parties in Germany financed? Well, they are financed with taxpayer money. If you read the polls as a party prior to the election, and you can estimate that you'll get around 30% of the vote, it's pretty much how much you can spend on campaigning. And if you then get these 30% of the votes, you will get an amount of money based on the percentage of votes you received. So the German political parties are pretty much independent from outside financial sources. And they're completely immune to anything like primaries, these doesn't exist or anything. So there really isn't an incentive to even properly try, They just go through the motions because it's enough.
Oh yeah, there isn't even a mechanism for like a group of like dissenters to be within the party.
No, not really. They pretty it's the parties in Germany are highly organized top-down structures. The top tells the base how to vote, and then the base will confirm what the party leadership has decided. So for example, when they have a party conference, like every 2 years or whatever, the head of the party will stand for election. There will be no other candidates, and then they will check, okay, how many votes did he get? Like 80%? Well, that's a decent result. Anything below 70 is considered a bad result. And once the vote has been held, people will check. For how many minutes did they applaud their dear party leader? 6 minutes? Well, that's all right, 11 minutes? Oh, that's great. I mean, inadvertently, German politics is becoming a bit Chinese, if you will.
That reminds me of Stalin. The thing about counting how many minutes somebody's clapping in a speech. That sounds like something Stalin would do. Actually, I believe that is something they
absolutely.
would do. I believe the number of times you clapped for how long is if you would live or not. But
Mm-hmm.
it's much more open in the Soviet Union. But
And this, of course, to tie it back to the Reichsbürger, the Reichsbürger, of course, have their corresponding, not movement, but cultural phenomenon, where people become increasingly nostalgic for the GDR, for communist Germany, because this was, for all its faults, it was a pretty homogenous, essentially ethno-state, where with the economy was all fucked up. You couldn't buy anything, but on the other hand, you were free from globalization. And if you lived in a small town, you pretty much still had the same family structures in the 80s as you had in the 1950s. I mean, yes, I know, like the Eastern Bloc wasn't based, across the board. You still had, abortion and legalized this, legalized that. But a couple of the ill effects of globalization simply did not affect communist Germany, leading to this kind of nostalgia. In a way, a lot of people are grasping for some kind of vision that gets them out of the status quo, but of course, none of them are politically viable as of now.
Yes, in the current system, anything like that wouldn't even be tolerated within the media mainstream opinion.
I truly, truly believe that there will be no meaningful political change in Germany unless something has happened before, at least in the US, or better yet, in the US and a couple of larger European countries. Um, I mean, there's always the question if there's a country in Europe which will be for the pause what North Korea is for communism, like keeping going for a couple of more decades. And if any country does that, it's probably Germany or Sweden, to be honest.
Yeah, if I had to guess, it'd be one of those two. They're just so influenced and have been, under direct military, well, not Sweden, but cultural influence of the GAE for so long now that they're the most loyal to the empire. Or be the least willing to kind of shake those old narratives, which are destroying their nation.
I sometimes wonder if the European countries are the model project of what they would like the US to look like. In a way, you can always tell that what's happening in the US is a couple of years ahead of the curve compared to us in some regards. Like, for example, BLM started earlier in the US than it did start here. But we did get it eventually. But I think other stuff like, being post-national and everything, this started here or flourished here before it did over in America.
Yeah, that's how it works. All these narratives have their births in the American institutions, the colleges, the federal government, and then it kind of gets passed down to these other colonies of the empire. Canada usually being the first and most eager to adopt them. Then the UK, Germany, Sweden, France, all the rest of the NATO bloc, except for a few countries. That's how that cycle usually goes.
Just a second. Could we take a 2-minute break?
Yes. So just to catch you up to speed, in case you are wondering, we discovered that the monarchist restoration attempt that was attempted was more or less a Jan 6 event that we've come to the conclusion was just a few boomers LARPing and wasn't actually anything serious or could potentially achieve anything. More than likely, it was just like Jan 6, although it seems based and we like it, but ultimately, without an actual plan to effectively have regime change, you're not going to fundamentally change the elites that are currently in charge of the political structure. And so, marching or storming a federal building or capitol isn't going to achieve anything besides a couple of memes and saved worthy images that people in our sphere will cherish, like the Q shaman or some of these other types. But as we're seeing in Brazil right now, they're doing the same thing, like I said, without a plan to fundamentally change the elites or get the military on your side. You're not going to finally achieve the results we want. And these countries, you're just not. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have the same regime in power, unless fundamentally the military flips, decides to support you in any way. But that isn't guaranteed, as we see right now. So, in conclusion, the monarchist restoration attempt in Germany, based in concept, however, horrible in execution and questionable whether or not it was glowy. Well, more than likely, it was glowy. Is the conclusion that I have come to, based on some of the things our friend has told us about some of the motivations behind these people and kind of where they come from. All of these movements are based, and we do appreciate them. Ultimately, without an actual plan to circulate the elites, you're not going to remove the regime in power. I was just going over some of the conclusions based on the title about this attempt. And like in
Nice.
conclusion, it was
Excellent,
just like
excellent.
Jan 6. based in concept, horrible in execution, and doesn't understand how politics and power actually functions.
Well, I mean, one of the weird things about a couple of European countries, and Germany possibly to a larger degree than some others, is that during the Cold War we had a bit of a, if you will, equilibrium of subversion, with the Russians and the Americans keeping each other at bay to some degree. The problem is, of course, that this led to exactly the points being strengthened the most, on which they could vaguely agree on. So liberal universalist values, while not being actualized in the Soviet Union, of course, but were pushed by them in Germany and by the US. So you get this weird mixture right now in terms of the general subversion, while the resistance to this can't really grasp onto anything. You can try to be pro-Russian in Germany, but again, I mean, if you are a true to the bone mid-century German, you're not really fond of Russia either. So it's all a bit, wavering around and too fluid to properly tackle right now, which makes the attempts, like we saw a couple of weeks back with the supposed coup by the Reichsbürger, make look so pathetic because there's just no platform for them to stand on.
No, it is. It's like such a boomer mentality of we're gonna gather a couple of guys with guns. We're gonna storm the Capitol, and then we're gonna finally do something. We never get to that point, so we don't know what actually that part of the plan is. But it's like it doesn't make any sense throughout all of human history. That's not how coups actually work.
And something for which these people probably never account is that complaining and moaning is part of the German national character. We don't hold small talk. We'll moan and complain and bitch a little bit, about the weather, politicians, and everything. So if you go around town, you will meet a lot of people who more or less seem like they're really displeased with how things are going, and they aren't actually happy about how things are going. But when the rubber meets the road, they'll never back some kind of dissident movement. They can be dissatisfied with the government or the system as much as you like. They'll never going to abandon the basic structure and just join ranks with some kind of upstart group.
No, not in the current climate. The opportunity just isn't there for that to happen, fundamentally. But getting into some more recent stuff, what do you think the future of Germany is? Do you think it can be positive, or do you think it's going to continue down the path it's going?
Now, while I am, to preface this, by no means an accelerationist, I think the best chance of some kind of change in Germany is through the economic hardship that lies ahead. I mean, we talked off stream a bit about how German industry is hit by soaring energy prices and so on. But this, of course, is impacting small business as well. So the situation really is dire for quite a lot of people out there. And even though it's not dramatic right now, most people manage to pretty much get on so far. Gas prices are high, both for heating as well as for, gasoline. But nothing serious has happened so far. But if anything is going to happen politically in Germany, it will come through some kind of economic collapse. And one of the preconditions for some change happening in Germany is, in my estimate, that the culturally hegemonic situation of the Green Party and the environmentalists, which is in Germany maybe stronger than anywhere else in Europe, that this gets shattered. Because naturally, of course, their policies of quitting nuclear and so on have contributed to the current mess that Germany is in greatly. For example, they have opposed fracking and so on and so on. So this could be a route through which some change could come. And then also economically. You always have the euro as a linchpin, and depending on how volatile financial markets are going to be throughout this year, the euro could crash and burn. And if this happens, I'm not sure the EU can scramble together resources to plug the holes, as they did in 2011, 2012, when Greece was about to default. So I think this is the most likely inroad for some kind of change in Germany.
Yeah, I think I concur as well. Like standards, like people are just way too comfortable. You still have, football, soccer, whatever the country's made sport is, and like Uber Eats. Like as long as they're, as long as the breaded circuses still function, people just aren't going to like finally do the things that we like are necessary because like it's still too comfortable for them. But things are going to have to get worse before they get better. I think
Yes.
we all know that at this point.
I think the only mini white pill that I could offer here is relating to the circuses, because as you in America may have vaguely noticed, there was a World Cup played a few weeks ago. And as you also might have noticed, the Germany's completely shit the bed and crashed out in the group stage for the second time in a row. And the people were still kind of shocked in 2018. They were disappointed and everything. But people have grown so disillusioned, they almost didn't expect the team to do well, while the national team tried to portray confidence or whatever. So I think in small areas like this, you can sense that that the trust and the faith and the optimism of the people is slowly eroding. We're a long way to go from any kind of positive or alternative vision, but the status quo is becoming, and has already become, less and less appealing.
No, I think people are starting to notice that, like when they look at their nationalist team and they see that the French team has no French players, the German team has no German players. Like they're gonna like start to question their subconscious narrative that like, hey, maybe this like liberalism thing, we're all equal, nation, and or just an idea. Maybe that's not such a great idea. Possibly to wake them up in a sense.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, we see what AA is sometimes talking about, that you have to compare the revealed preference rather than the stated preference. And if you look, of course, where the most pro-immigration people live, it's usually places where our more swarthy new citizens do not live. And they can cheer on the national team as much as they want. It's fairly obvious that they don't actually want to live with these people.
No, it's the same thing in the U.S. All these people who vote for the party that wants open immigration, on both sides too, but people who are the most vocal about this live in the most white gated communities in every single state, and this remains true even in the European countries. And these will be the same people screaming about inclusivity and tolerance, for the new immigrants that we must accept, as they live in gated communities that are like 90% white, European. And of course, if those people actually try to come into those communities, they'll be begging for security to come bail them out immediately to disperse them.
Arrested and executed by based Green Party supporters. Which of course, here it intersects neatly are the group of voters in the country who fly abroad the most, have the largest cars and everything, while preaching that the chuds shouldn't eat meat.
Yes, it's always the case. The people who are upper middle class, even in lower tier elite status, are the most vocal supporters of the regime because they benefit the most financially from it. And it's the disaffected, dispossessed, middle class and lower that are the most vocally against this in the hinterlands and like some suburbs of cities.
And going back to something I said earlier about Germany to some degree being a system that governs itself, I read an insane stat last year. These were government statistics that the Green Party and the Social Democrats, the membership of their party, more than 40% of their members are government employees. So in essence, it truly is. It's basically a government that finances itself, that finances its own party, which is staffed with, public employees.
Oh, that's quite interesting stuff. I didn't know that actually. Oh, that would make sense. The regime, people in the regime would be the most vocal supporters of the regime, and you can have a positive, like a monetary loop of funding with that system. Because you don't have things like PACs here in the U.S., where you have a bunch of finance laws and things like that.
No, not really. I mean, there's still lobby groups that can try to convince individual politicians, but the German parties are trying to make sure that they are completely financially independent from any outside influence. Now, especially on the local level, this of course is less the case. If you are some industrial big shot in a small town, you can still influence politics, and if your interests economically already align with some kind of party, you usually can influence them a little bit further. But generally, these parties try to be truly financially independent, and they also try to create their own loyalists. For example, every political party in Germany has an official foundation, which is taxpayer funded and which is active in the universities, giving away scholarships. So it's a self-perpetuating system.
Yeah, I think we see similar elements to the U.S. with major corporations having their own funds, NGOs types. The private government distinction, which we all know there is no distinction. They both work hand in hand to ensure the current people remain in power. But moving on to a different subject before we kind of close out the stream. So, what are your thoughts on the current situation in Eastern Europe? Where do you see like the ultimate outcome of this conflict being? Many conflicting theories about how this one and the implications, whether it will benefit the GE, GAE, or these kind of dissidents trying to be multipolar powers in the East.
Now, I think one thing we can rule out categorically is that Ukraine and Russia will sign some kind of treaty that will, legalize any kind of territorial gains that have been made, and that will end the conflict for good. I think there will be no clean end to this. I don't really see Russia scoring a blowout victory and completely taking over Ukraine, and I also think that all hopes of a true regime change in Russia are completely delusional. I think the most likely outcome for in that region is a kind of frozen conflict that gets a bit more intense here, a bit less intense there, where essentially Russia or Ukraine could increase the intensity of the conflict whenever they want. I think Russia probably realizes that Europe will have a hard time to make it through the next winter as relatively smoothly as they did this year. So I think even if the conflict should get a little bit more quiet throughout 2023, it will probably pick back up next winter. Maybe not in terms of large-scale offenses, but I think diplomatically things are not going to fundamentally change for quite some time.
Oh, that's an interesting theory. I think my kind of theory is they kind of want to use that frozen conflict thing you mentioned to kind of bleed out Russia, because Russia has the same problems as the other country in the West, declining birth rates, and also just like they don't have the same amount of resources the West does to fund like endless wars, with proxy groups giving them endless amounts of weapons. So the theory is from some people they want to keep this going so they can like bleed Russia dry.
Yes.
And I don't think Russia would benefit strategically or in the long term with a conflict that continues to go on. The West would ultimately probably have the upper hand in that situation. But I think we both sides ultimately lose from this conflict, either way.
Yes, I think if Russia is playing for time, the best thing they can hope for is some kind of economic meltdown that would probably affect the Eurozone the most. Um, I think to some degree, of course, the US is content with the conflict continuing because they know it to some degree hurts their friends and allies over in Europe way more than it hurts them. And I think we could see a recurrence of that old Cold War theme of Russia and the US um, playing their games while Europe takes a beating.
Yes, our players in the chessboard in the middle between the great powers are always the ones who suffer the greatest in these power conflicts.
Yes, yes. And I mean, we have the usual suspects in Europe, the so-called pigs countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And I mean, I wouldn't bet a dime on their long-term economic stability, both in terms of like the overall economy and, of course, more detailed fiscal questions about the national debt they have. Because, of course, if we want to tackle inflation, the conventional wisdom would tell us to raise interest rates. But you can't really raise interest rates if you're overburdened with debt already.
Or telling all your allies that you must send weapons and money
Yes,
to
yes.
an ongoing conflict
Mm.
to in Eastern Europe, which is quite expensive to maintain for a lot of these countries. But in closing, do you have anything you'd like to show before we kind of close out the stream?
Well, if people like, they can follow me on Twitter. I technically do have a Substack where I'm very infrequently writing something about which I have a pretty guilty conscience. But if you like, you can check that out as well. But no, in general, just thanks for having me. And let's see what the year holds for us in stock.
Indeed, let's hope it's better than 2022. Well,
It's
thanks for
gotta be.
joining me. And remember, everyone, the lie can't last forever. Keep your hopes up.